She was already inside. That was the part that would stay with her longest, not what she saw, not what spoke to her from the far end of that corridor, but the simple, impossible fact that she had no memory of opening the door. One moment Lilith Voss was sitting at the nurse's station, paperwork in front of her, cold coffee at her elbow, the quiet hum of the hospital at night surrounding her like it always did. The next, she was here. Inside the East Wing. Standing in a corridor that had been sealed for nearly 4 decades, breathing air that tasted like something preserved rather than something lived in. Her scrubs were clean. Her hands were shaking. The corridor stretched ahead of her under failing emergency lighting, long, narrow, the kind of light that turns everything the color of old bone. Doors on either side, all closed. All numbered in a style that hadn't been used since the 80s. The floor was thick with undisturbed dust, except for one set of footprints leading forward. Hers. She turned around. Behind her, where the door should have been, where she was certain she had not walked through a door, there was only wall. Smooth. Unbroken. Like the entrance had never existed. Lilith pressed her back against it anyway. "This isn't real," she whispered. Her own voice sounded wrong in the silence, too small, absorbed too quickly. "I was just at the nurse's station. I was just." A sound from somewhere ahead. Soft. Almost gentle. And then a voice, low, unhurried, the voice of someone who had been waiting a very long time and had made a kind of peace with the waiting. "You always say that," it said. The first time. 3 weeks earlier. Crestfield General was not the kind of hospital that made an impression on arrival. It was large without being grand, functional without being modern, the sort of building that had been added to incrementally over 60 years until it had lost any coherent sense of itself. It sat on the eastern edge of a mid-sized city, backing onto a stretch of land that had once been industrial and hadn't quite decided what it wanted to become next. At night, from the upper floors, you could see the lights of the expressway in the distance, a reminder that the world outside was still moving, even when everything inside had gone still. Lilith Voss had transferred to Crestfield from a hospital 2 cities over, following a divorce that had quietly reorganized every corner of her life. She was 34, methodical, good under pressure, and had the particular emotional self-containment of someone who had learned, through necessity rather than preference, to rely entirely on herself. She wasn't unhappy. She was simply operating in a stripped-back version of her life, and the night shift suited that, the quiet, the routine, the absence of an audience. Her first week was unremarkable. The ward was manageable. Her colleagues were cordial without being intrusive. She learned the building's rhythms the way you learn any new space, where the supply closet was, which elevator ran slow, which family rooms to avoid after 2 a.m. because the grief in them had a way of following you back to the desk. 2 things registered as slightly off. Not wrong enough to name. Just slightly off. The first was the East Wing. It occupied the far end of the ground floor corridor, separated from the rest of the hospital by a set of heavy double doors that had been chained shut with a padlock so old it had begun to oxidize. Signage on the doors read, "Wing closed, NO access, maintenance authorized personnel only." The paint on the signs had faded to the point of near illegibility, which told Lilith the signs had been there a long time and no one had felt the need to replace them. She asked about it on her second night. Dutch, the security guard who did the overnight rounds, a broad, unhurried man of 58 who had worked at Crestfield longer than some of the walls looked like they'd been standing, told her it had been closed for structural reasons. Subsidence, he thought, or something to do with the electrical system. He wasn't specific and she didn't push. But twice in that first week, Passing the east wing doors on her way between wards, she heard something on the other side. A rhythmic sound. Soft and slow, like footsteps moving back and forth across a contained space. Pacing. She stood at the doors both times and listened. And both times, after about 30 seconds, it stopped. The second thing was the patient in room 4C. He had been admitted for observation, a man in his mid-60s, no family listed, no regular physician on record. His chart was thin to the point of near blankness. His name was listed as R. Caro, though no one seemed to refer to him by name. He mostly slept. When he was awake he was quiet, watching the middle distance with the focused patience of someone accustomed to waiting. On Lilith's third night, she did his routine check. Vitals, chart notation, the standard brief exchange of a patient who is stable and a nurse who has 7 others to see. She was turning to leave when he spoke. "They said you'd come," he said. His voice was slow and careful, like each word was being selected. "I've been waiting." Lilith paused. She turned back. "Mr. Caro, do you know where you are?" "I know exactly where I am," he said. Then he closed his eyes, as if the conversation was finished. She noted the exchange in his chart. Flagged it as possible confusion. Moved on. By the end of week 1, she was sleeping better. The hospital had begun to feel manageable in the way that unfamiliar places eventually do, the strangeness smoothed down by repetition into something that merely felt like routine. She called a friend on her day off and said, "It's fine. I think I was worried for nothing." She believed that when she said it. If this kind of story keeps you up at night, you're not alone. Stay close. Because what comes next is where it stops being something Lilith can explain away. Week 2. The pacing sound from the east wing was louder. Lilith noticed it on the Monday, her first night back after 2 days off, and she noticed it immediately, the way you notice a sound that your brain has already quietly catalogued as significant. It was the same rhythm as before, the same contained back and forth, but closer now to the door. As though whatever was producing it had moved toward the entrance. She timed it on the third night. It started at 3:04 a.m. It stopped at 3:08. 4 minutes, almost exactly. Every night. She mentioned it to Dutch on Thursday. She watched his face as she spoke, and what she saw there wasn't confusion or curiosity. It was stillness. The specific, practiced stillness of a man receiving information he already had. "Old buildings settle," he said. "You get used to it. Dutch, it's rhythmic. It's not settling. You get used to it," he said again, and changed the subject with the efficiency of someone who had redirected this exact conversation before. Lilith let it go. She wasn't sure why. Later she would think it was because some part of her had already understood that pushing would open something she wasn't ready for. The mirror incident happened on a Tuesday. She was in the staff bathroom, end of a shift, washing her hands. The bathroom was single occupancy, a flat overhead light, a mirror above the basin that was slightly too large for the space. Functional. Unremarkable. She was reaching for a paper towel when she caught her reflection doing something wrong. Not a flicker. Not a trick of the light. A genuine, measurable delay, her hand already holding the towel while her reflection was still reaching for it. Half a second behind. Maybe more. Lilith stood completely still and stared at her reflection. Her reflection stared back. And then, slowly, it caught up. She stood there for a long time after that, hands braced on the edge of the basin, not quite willing to look away and not quite able to understand what she'd seen. Eventually she turned off the light and left. She told herself it was exhaustion. She told herself the fluorescent light had stuttered. She told herself there was a rational explanation and she simply didn't have enough sleep to locate it. She was good at telling herself things. For C escalated in the third week. Our Caro had begun requesting her by name. Not the night nurse, not the woman who does the rounds. Lilith. Specifically, precisely, with the confidence of someone who had been told. She confronted him about it on a Wednesday night, keeping her voice level, clinical. Mr. Caro. I need to ask you something, and I'd like you to think carefully before you answer. How do you know my name? He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise. You told me, he said simply. Last Tuesday. You sat with me for almost an hour. We talked about the hospital. About the East Wing. The East Wing. Mr. Caro, Lilith said carefully. I wasn't working last Tuesday. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, I know what I remember. She left his room and stood in the corridor for a while, running through the conversation several times, looking for the misunderstanding. There wasn't one. Either he was deeply confused, possible, clinical, something to document, or someone had been in his room, using her name, telling him things she had never said. Neither option settled easily. The photograph turned up 4 days later. She found it while looking for a pen in the staff break room, pinned to a corkboard behind a layer of more recent notices, visible only because one corner was lifting away from the board. A group photograph, printed on paper that had gone the color of weak tea. Staff event, by the look of it. Taken outside the hospital's main entrance. 30 or so people, most in uniform, arranged in the loose self-conscious cluster of people who have been asked to stand together for a camera. Lilith almost didn't look at it properly. She was tired and running slightly late, and it was just an old photograph. But something made her stop. Something in the peripheral catch of the image as she started to turn away. She looked. In the lower right corner of the photograph, standing slightly apart from the main group as though she hadn't quite committed to being in the picture, a woman. 30s. Similar build to Lilith. A face that was close enough to her own that several seconds passed before Lilith could fully account for the differences. At the bottom of the photograph, handwritten in the careful cursive of someone who had documented things for the record, Staff Summer Event, 1986. Names listed beneath, left to right. The woman in the corner, Mara K. Lilith took the photograph off the board. She stood under the break room light and looked at it for a long time. That night she did not sleep well. And she began, quietly, to look into things. Hospital archives were not difficult to access if you knew what you were looking for and had a legitimate administrative reason to be looking. Lilith told herself she had both. The archive room sat in the basement, 2 floors below the night ward, accessible via a stairwell that smelled of old paper and something faintly chemical. It was not a room that saw much traffic. The filing system was partially digitized and partially not, the transition having apparently stalled somewhere in the mid-90s and never fully resumed. Physical records from before 2000 lived in gray cardboard boxes on metal shelving, organized by year, then department, then type. She went on her break. She had 40 minutes. It took her 11 to find the first file. The deaths were not hidden, exactly. They were simply filed in the way that institutions file things they do not wish to be asked about, correctly, completely, in the right place, under the right category, with all the appropriate documentation, and then left to become unfindable through sheer volume and administrative distance. 4 nurses. All female. All transferred in from other hospitals rather than hired locally. All in their 30s at time of death. All assigned to the East Wing during their first month on the night shift. All dead within 30 days of their start date. The causes of death were listed with the clean, definitive language of official records doing their job: cardiac event, acute cardiac event, accidental fall, cardiac arrest. Separate incidents. Separate years. Every 5 years. Lilith sat back in her chair and looked at that for a moment. Every 5 years, like something that ran on a cycle. Like something that needed feeding on a schedule. The last file was the thinnest. A nurse who had joined the night staff in September of 1986 and died 11 days later. Her personal details were sparse, transferred from a hospital in another district, no next of kin listed, no formal inquest beyond the standard paperwork. She had been assigned to the East Wing. She had worked 4 shifts there. Her name was listed as Mara K. Lilith looked at the file for a long time. Then she looked at the photograph she had been carrying in her pocket since the break room. Then she looked back at the file. Mara K. had been 33 years old. Lilith was 34. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it. She returned upstairs. She sat at the nurse's station for the remainder of her shift and did her job with the focused, deliberate attention of someone who needs to keep their hands busy while their mind is somewhere else entirely. In the morning she requested a meeting with Dr. Lilith Voss. His office was on the 2nd floor, south side, a room that managed to feel both official and somehow temporary, as though it had been arranged by someone who expected to be asked to vacate it at short notice. Dr. Voss himself was a tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the particular brand of unhurried calm that senior hospital administrators develop over years of being the last person in any room to show concern. He listened to Lilith without interrupting. His expression remained attentive and pleasant throughout, which was itself, she realized, slightly wrong. Genuine concern would have shifted something in his face. This didn't. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "The records you're describing are incomplete," he said. "Partial files from that era are unfortunately common. The digitization process flagged dozens of gaps. As for the East Wing, the decision to seal it was made for a combination of reasons, mostly structural and financial. It was not a response to any specific incident. For nurses died in 5-year intervals in that wing. For patients died in that wing," he said, with a gentle correction that landed like a door closing. Nurses and patients both. It was a busy ward during a difficult period. Correlation isn't causation, Lilith. She noticed he used her first name. She hadn't told him to. "I'd appreciate," he continued, his tone remaining entirely pleasant, "if you kept this between us for now. Sharing incomplete historical information with other staff tends to create anxiety that isn't useful to anyone. You understand?" It wasn't a question. Lilith stood to leave. She was nearly at the door when he spoke again, the way people do when they want something to sound like an afterthought but have been saving it for the exit. "You're settling in well, by the way. We're glad you're here." A brief pause. "The hospital has a way of finding exactly who it needs." She walked out of his office and stood in the corridor and breathed for a moment. "The hospital has a way of finding exactly who it needs." She turned the sentence over and over on her way back to the ward, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the interpretation that made it harmless. She couldn't find one. Dutch was doing his midnight rounds when she intercepted him in the east corridor. She had been waiting near the wing doors for 20 minutes, which she was aware was not the behavior of someone who was fine. He saw her and slowed, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not quite. More like a man who has been dreading a specific conversation finally seeing it arrive. Dutch. She kept her voice low and even. Who decided to hire me? He didn't answer. He looked at the floor between them. Dutch. You should go home when your shift ends, he said finally. His voice was quieter than she'd heard it before, the voice of someone saying something they'd told themselves they'd never say. Don't stay late. Don't walk the east corridor after 2. And whatever you hear at 3 o'clock, don't open that door. What's inside? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he looked up and met her eyes, and what she saw in his face was the specific, exhausted expression of someone who has been carrying a thing for a very long time and has never been permitted to put it down. Something, he said carefully, that already knows your name. He walked away. She let him go. She stood in the east corridor alone for a while, listening. At 3:04, the pacing began. If you're still here, good. Because this is the point where it stops being something Lilith can choose to walk away from. Whatever you do, don't go anywhere. She came in the next night intending to resign. The decision had settled over her during the day with the particular clarity that comes after a night of not sleeping, clean, certain, free of second-guessing. She would hand the letter to the front desk, collect her personal items from her locker, and leave Crestfield General without looking back. Whatever was happening here, whatever the East Wing was, whatever had happened to 4 women before her, was not her problem to solve. She had not been hired to solve it. She had been hired, she was beginning to understand, for an entirely different purpose, and that purpose was one she had no intention of fulfilling. She had the letter in her bag when she walked through the main entrance at 11 p.m. She was intercepted before she reached the front desk. The call came from the ward, for C, the night nurse said, had deteriorated. Agitated, distressed, requesting Lilith specifically. Refusing to be settled by anyone else. She told herself she would go in, see him, and then resign. 5 minutes. Then she was done. Art Caro was sitting upright in his bed when she entered, and the change in him from the previous nights was significant enough that she set aside everything else immediately, the way clinical instinct overrides personal crisis when something is genuinely wrong. He was pale and his hands were moving restlessly against the blanket, and his eyes, when they found her, held a focused urgency that had not been there before. You're going to leave, he said. Not a question. Mr. Caro, I need you to calm down. I know you're going to leave. She told me you would. His hands stilled. She said, when you start thinking about leaving, that's when I need to tell you. Lilith sat down slowly. Tell me what? She's still in there. His voice dropped. The other one. She never left. She's been in that wing for 38 years, waiting for someone to come in and see her, really see her. Not run. Not close their eyes. Just see her. And if someone does that, she said, it ends. She can go. Who told you this? She did. He held her gaze steadily. Every night. Through the wall. Lilith sat with that for a moment. Mr. Caro, she said carefully. Even if I believed you, why me? Why does it have to be me? He looked at her with something that might have been compassion. Because you're the same, he said simply. You're the closest she's ever had. She said you're the only one who could look at her without it breaking you. Lilith sat in a chair beside his bed for a long time after he closed his eyes. She sat there until his breathing had evened out and the ward had gone properly quiet and the clock above the door had moved to 2:47 a.m. Then she stood up, put her bag on her shoulder, and walked out of room 4C. She told herself she was walking to the front desk. She walked to the east wing instead. The padlock was gone. Not broken, not cut, simply gone, as though it had never been there. The chain hung loose through the door handles, unthreaded, coiled on the floor like something discarded. The doors themselves stood slightly open, a gap of perhaps 6 inches, just enough to see the darkness inside and feel the quality of the air that was moving gently outward through it, cool and still and old. Lilith stood in front of those doors at 2:58 a.m. She heard nothing from inside. No pacing. No sound at all. She thought about 4 dead nurses filed in gray cardboard boxes. She thought about Dutch's face when he'd said something that already knows your name. She thought about Dr. Voss and his pleasant, empty expression and his careful language and the way he'd said the hospital has a way of finding exactly who it needs, like he was proud of it. She thought about a woman named Mara Kay, who had come to this hospital in the autumn of 1986, alone, in her 30s, transferred from somewhere else. Who had worked 4 shifts in the East Wing and then died, and been filed away, and apparently never stopped being here. At 3 a.m. exactly, from somewhere deep inside the wing, the knocking began. Deliberate. Measured. A slow and patient rhythm that traveled down the corridor and through the gap in the doors and into Lilith's chest like something looking for a place to settle. And then, she would never fully be able to explain this, the rhythm shifted. Fractionally. Barely perceptibly. But enough. The knocking reorganized itself around something that was almost a pattern, almost a sound that had almost a shape, and the shape it almost had was almost her name. Lilith. 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 She pushed the doors open and walked inside. The corridor was exactly what she had seen in those first disoriented seconds of the cold open, because this was that moment, arrived at last, the loop closing on itself. The failing emergency lighting. The doors numbered in the old style. The floor with its thick undisturbed dust and the single set of footprints leading forward. Hers. She walked. The knocking stopped when she was approximately halfway down the corridor. The silence that replaced it was not empty, it was the silence of something that has been waiting and has now registered that the wait is over. At the far end of the corridor, in the doorway of what had once been the East Wing's primary treatment room, a figure was standing. Female. Slight. Wearing scrubs in a style that hadn't been used since the 80s, a detail that landed with the weight of a confirmation rather than a surprise. Standing perfectly still with her hands at her sides, face angled slightly downward. Lilith kept walking. Every piece of her that was still operating on rational logic was producing a continuous, urgent signal. Stop, turn around, go back, this is not something you can manage, and she kept walking anyway, because the thing that was overriding it was not bravery. It was recognition. The specific, gut-level recognition of looking at something that is irrefutably, inexplicably, deeply connected to you. She stopped 3 feet away. The figure raised its head. The face was hers. Not similar. Not reminiscent. Hers, her own face, her own eyes, her own bone structure and the particular set of her jaw that she'd seen in mirrors and photographs her whole life. But older than she was now, and worn in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with duration. The face of someone who has been holding a single position for an unimaginable length of time and has simply endured. The figure looked at her. And what Lilith saw in the expression was not threat, not malice, not the hunger of something that wanted to consume her. It was exhaustion. And something that was very close to relief. "You have to choose," the figure said. Its voice was her voice, flattened by years of disuse into something quieter and more careful. "One of us walks back out. One of us stays. That's always been the arrangement." "I'm not staying here," Lilith said. The figure looked at her steadily. "Neither was I," it said. Lilith turned around. The corridor behind her had already begun to change, the doors she had walked through narrowing, the gap between them shrinking, the light from the hospital proper compressing into a thin bright sliver that was getting thinner as she watched. She ran. The dust came up around her feet and the light ahead kept narrowing and the corridor seemed to be extending, stretching, producing more of itself in front of her the way corridors do in nightmares. But she ran anyway, not thinking, not calculating, just moving, because the sliver of light was still there and while it was there she had something to run toward. She hit the doors with both hands and forced herself through the gap in the last second before it closed and she was on her hands and knees on the corridor floor outside, chest heaving, the hospital's ordinary institutional light falling over her like something solid. The doors sealed behind her. The sound they made was not a click or a bang. It was softer than that, like something exhaling after a very long time. Lilith stayed on the floor for a moment. Then she became aware of someone standing nearby and looked up. Dutch. 10 feet away, in the corridor, watching her. Still in his uniform. Hands at his sides. He did not look surprised. He did not move to help her up. He just looked at her with the face of a man receiving a verdict. "Did you see her?" he asked. Lilith got to her feet slowly. "Yes." He nodded once, the way people nod when they've been told something they needed to hear and aren't sure yet whether it's good news or bad. "Then it'll be quiet for a while," he said. Lilith looked at him for a long moment. "For a while," she said. "Yes. And then you'll need someone new." Dutch said nothing. Which was its own answer. She handed in her resignation at 7:15 in the morning. Dr. Voss was already in his office, which was itself a small wrongness. She had never known him to be in before 9. He accepted the letter without reading it, set it on his desk, and looked at her with the same pleasant, calibrated expression he always wore. "I understand," he said. "These decisions are always personal." "I'm sure you'll find someone," Lilith said. "We always do," he said. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she left his office, collected her things from her locker, and walked out of Crestfield General into a pale morning that smelled of rain and exhaust and ordinary life continuing without interruption. She sat in her car in the hospital car park and did not start the engine for a while. She had her phone in her hand. She wasn't sure how long she'd been looking at it before she understood what she was doing, pulling up the photograph she had taken of the 1986 staff picture. The one from the break room corkboard. The one she had been carrying with her since the day she found it. She looked at the photograph for the last time. Mara K, standing slightly apart from the group in the lower right corner. The face that looked like Lilith's face. The woman who had come to Crestfield in the autumn of 1986 and never really left. Lilith had looked at this photograph a dozen times over the past 2 weeks. She had studied it, analyzed it, used it as evidence and as comfort and as warning. She had never, until this moment, zoomed in. She zoomed in now. Mara K was smiling. A small, controlled smile, the kind you produce when someone tells you to look at the camera and you comply without quite committing to it. But her eyes were not looking at the camera. They were looking at something just behind the photographer. Something to the right, and slightly above, at a specific point in the middle distance. Something that none of the other 30 people in the photograph seemed to notice or react to. Something that had apparently been there in September of 1986, on a sunny day outside Crestfield General, while the staff gathered for a summer photograph and someone's colleague stood slightly apart and looked at a thing no one else could see, and smiled. Lilith put her phone face down on the passenger seat. She started the engine. She drove. If this one stayed with you, it's supposed to. There's more where this came from. And if you're already thinking about what Mara K was looking at, so are we.